Welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Kalideep Chaudhary, and I'm here to talk to our distinguished guest, Professor T.V. Paul, James McGill Professor of International Relations at McGill University, on India's quest for great power status. A special welcome to all of you on our online participants. This program is a focus on South Asia from the Asia Pacific Affairs Forum of the Commonwealth Club and has been recorded and live streamed on the Commonwealth Club's YouTube channel and will be available for download later. Thank you for joining us. We encourage you to become a member of the club. To learn more, please visit the club's website on commonwealthclub.org. Before we jump in, a reminder, if you have any questions, please post them on our YouTube chat box. Those questions will be forwarded to me throughout the program. Let us now begin. The 20th century saw the fall of several great powers. The British and the French empires come to mind. It saw the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. It also established the preeminence of Pax Americana. What does the 21st century bring? In 2022, India surpassed the United Kingdom as the fifth largest economy in the world. And since the 1990s, a series of US presidents have acclaimed India as a rising power that deserves to be recognized as a lead actor in the international arena. In his new book, A Sweeping Account of India's Uneven Rise in the Global System, The Unfinished Quest, India's Quest for Major Power Status, Professor T.V. Paul of McGill University focuses on the key motivations driving India's leaders. It looks at India's evolution as an inclusive, tolerant democracy that can develop and utilize its most prized asset as it seeks to develop major power status, and this most prized asset is its demographic dividend. Professor Paul is the author, editor of 23 books, and the author of over 80 scholarly articles and book chapters. Professor Paul, a very warm welcome to you. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you, Khalid, for inviting me. This is wonderful to be with you.
Thank you so much. First of all, congratulations on the book. What was the motivation behind the book? Why the book? Why now?
I think the key motivation is this phenomenon called rising power. You mentioned a little bit about the 20th century's fault lines with respect to the rise and fall of great powers have been the most violent phenomenon in terms of international politics, unacknowledged a whole lot in terms of general understanding. 20th century witnessed the largest number of deaths, some 50 million in Second World War, some 20 million in First World War. The largest cause of death other than natural causes was war by great powers or their proxy wars. And so I'm a student of international relations, and I like to see how a rising power can be accommodated, or it can be given its share, or will it be a conflictual process, as we witnessed, as you said, in the 20th century. So the problem is India is the candidate power, very much so, because it is 1/5 of humanity. It has got now the fifth largest economy in terms of nominal terms, but in purchasing power parity terms, it is third largest economy, and potentially will become number 3 and number 2, surpassing the United States by 2050 if the current growth rate continues. So India has been asserting this position, and under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, more aggressively, let's put it that way, to gain a status in the global system. But the process is not an easy one, as many Indians somehow believe that it will happen automatically. Not really. because the established powers have little incentive to give that status to a rising power. They will try to thwart that. As long as it is beneficial to them, they might. And always there is a resistance to a rising power. But India has achieved quite a bit peacefully. This has to be acknowledged. Quite a bit a result of the US-India nuclear accord of 2005 and the India's economic liberalization that began in 1991. And both these events have given India confidence that it could emerge as the next major power in the world system. And so the process is not an easy one, and I needed to know how historically it has evolved, how to understand it, explain it in a better way.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Before we dive too much into India, I would just like to set expectations for our audience, because you throw out a number of terms in your book. Could you please explain to our audience the differences between, say, a superpower, a global power, a major power, a swing power, and perhaps illustrate that with examples?
Okay, a superpower is one that has got a global capacity to intervene, to play a big role in any part of the world. And we only had two superpowers in modern history. Well, after World War II, of course. Before that, of course, Great Britain had quite a bit of the attributes of a global superpower. But the real superpower thing happened in the Cold War period, the United States and the Soviet Union. They also had the ability to destroy the world about 3 times. And so the superpower is the highest level. Then you have, in historical terms, it's great powers. As the Europeans only called great powers, all of them had a particular status in the international hierarchy. They were called meetings, started with Vienna in 1815. And it was kind of a multipolar system, multiple great powers, all having almost same capacity to influence events beyond their regions. So a great power is the term often used. Instead, sometimes people use major power. But the Europeans really invented this term to signify power differential in the international system. So middle power is one that is very dominant in its region, but not beyond. So India has been considered as a middle power, because it has the ability to play a big role in South Asia, which is now challenged by China. And then, of course, its aim is now going beyond South Asia. Then you have the smaller powers. Most of the states in the international arena are smaller states that don't have the ability to play a significant role, except some may use their soft power, like the Scandinavian countries, for their diplomatic skills, or let's say Singapore for its economic power or technological power. But most often they survive because the great powers simply don't bother them much, but sometimes they can be challenged. So this hierarchy or pyramid is questioned, because in these days, we don't want to talk about hierarchy much, but unfortunately it exists. And the desire of a country that is growing rapidly economically and other hard power indicators like military would like to play a bigger role in the international arena. And that's how India comes into the picture. There are others too, South Africa to Brazil would like to play a big role, but India has a lot more attributes than even Brazil, for that matter.
Thank you for that. So you've answered one part of the question. So do countries deliberately seek to be a major power, or does that come across by accident, or is it by design?
Deliberately seek, partly because they develop capabilities that give them the confidence that they should play a bigger role in the global system. So it has been bloody, as you know. Germany and Japan tried to do that in the early part of the 20th century. And then they develop the capabilities, but others won't accept them easily. Newcomers have a tough time getting into the club. It's like a club. And Then they started violent means, and that violence was reciprocated with much more intense violence. So the design is very much there. They had to have a grand strategy. That's what the term we often use. That tells that we are going to become a great power. We need recognition, and you need to recognize us. And their main target are other great powers, not smaller states, because the peer group really is that the one recognizes them.
And by contrast, are there some countries that, despite their capabilities, do not deliberately seek great power status, or is that an exception?
Well, the United States is a big example. It could have played a big role in the late 19th century, and Fareed Zakaria has a book about it. It chose not to. It became isolationist until 1895, and then the British withdrew from North America. So there is one example. Others are there, like India itself, some say had been reticent. There is a book by Manjari Chatterjee Miller on the study of the Netherlands. After being a great power, it withdrew from the international arena, somewhat reluctantly, but there are some theories about it. But you see a lot of middle powers like Indonesia, today's world. Indonesia could play a big role if it wants to, 200+ million people, growing economy, but it has chosen to be a normal state without much of ambition. So there are examples, but India has a lot of things I'll discuss in the book, hard power and soft power, which is you're a civilizational state, a state that contributed much to human civilization. It denied a global role because it was obviously colonized. And so when you look at that, it's the domestic process that is happening in India is very critical, which is the Hindu nationalism, which is also Prime Minister Modi's goal, that India ought to get its recognition by others. In the modern day, it basically means a great power status.
Yes, and you do mention that in the book about India, but I just want to revert back to an earlier question, because there are economic costs to being a major power, to being a superpower, isn't there?
There are costs and benefits. That's the important thing to recognize. The benefits are, and let me start with the benefits, that you play a big role in deciding the destinies of others and designing the rules of the game. You are called to meetings. You make your point. If you are not a member in clubs, you don't have a voice. And India didn't have much for a long period because it's not a member of the UN Security Council. And so this cost is, in that sense, a feeling of being a second-ranking actor. And that can be a socio-psychological feeling that is happened to many countries in the past. The cost is in terms of, if you are an aggressive great power, you will engage in unnecessary wars. And sometimes internal repression too, as many great powers, when they rose, Germany comes to mind, they needed to repress their minorities, thinking they are the fifth colonists. And this is a problem for great powers because they need the support of everybody, and they sometimes engage in all kinds of violence. And so there is cost involved, but if you can get it peacefully, which will be a tremendous achievement for India, for instance, it's actually a prime candidate to get this peacefully, as long as it doesn't end up in a war with China. Because it has now got the recognition of the United States, the other second-ranking members, Russia, China, UK, and France. But China border is the biggest challenge for India, and China's opposition to including India. So the costs are there. If China feels it is being challenged by India, there could be a war, and that is where the challenge comes. The other, of course, is the economic cost of spending money on defense. But the argument is that, say, in India's case, is less than 2% of its GDP right now. The country needs some level of defense preparedness. If you don't have a defense, they will come and dominate you. Okay, they means whoever will be the dominant power in the 21st century. So either be prepared or be willing to give up some of your hopeful status in the international system. So there is a cost involved in it, but it's up to you to decide what you want. Some people like to be in clubs, some people want to be out of it. Countries are like that.
Because some say the British Empire went under, not because it went under because of its economic costs of maintaining such a large empire. Is that statement generally true?
Well, the British Empire went down because of World War II. You know, there is a myth that somehow it was starting to decline a little bit. There were challengers. Of course, Germany challenged it in Africa and many other parts. The French were also not too happy with it before that. But the point is that the British Empire probably would have lasted some more years if there was no World War II. And after that, they couldn't hold on. The British Empire unnecessarily expanded. Okay, this is another phenomenon that the powers that become powerful think that they need to conquer as much as they can before others will come in. So British Empire took over Palestine, claiming that we need that to protect India, or get into wars with Afghanistan 3 times, thinking that the Russians were going to expand to the subcontinent. Some of them were actually based on myths, based on the idea that there's some indications, but nothing strange. And the fact that, a great power has this temptation, if there is no resistance, to keep expanding. And it may not be in the modern times, not necessarily physical expansion, but, China is cleverly putting the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, as an expansionist idea. But it is also physically expanding in the South China Sea. So this expansionism, some people say, can push others to respond. China's case in particular now, there's a lot of problem with China's assertion or claim over South China Sea. But China somehow thinks that it will become too overwhelmingly powerful one day, and they will all accept the dominance of China. The US would withdraw from the Pacific. So this problem of great power expansion is one thing that we study in international relations, realism as a school of thought. But there are ways to restrain that, which is, take the case of India. There is not a whole lot of room for India to expand, okay, unless you want to go and conquer Southeast Asia, which you don't want because these countries are friendly to you. So China's problem is too much assertion, and then you make more enemies. So a peaceful rise strategy at China, propounded before Xi Jinping's time, has a greater advantage than asserting too much militarily or others as second-ranking powers. They resist. And then, of course, the US factor, the US does not want a major change in the power structure. The US has every incentive to resist that as long as it can. So you get into conflict. So the key to achieving this goal peacefully is to play a role carefully in such a way that you are not being viewed as an aggressive state. Bismarck in Germany, or Prussian Empire, then turned into Germany, tried to do that and succeeded to some extent, but not a great extent. And then, of course, the Kaiser decided to dismiss him, and then you know the history of that. They started a naval arms race against Britain, and the British started finding it very threatening. Until then, they were okay. So the ambitions changed, and then others wouldn't accept you because you are really pushing hard. And this is a problem for many rising powers, Japan, for instance. But the international system has not found a way to peacefully accommodate a rising power. So I'm pitching that India could be that case study.
So in your book, you outline several attributes a major power, a great power must have, both soft and hard power. By those measures, apart from the United States, and you bring up China repeatedly in this conversation, and I'm going to dig further into this subject, but what attributes of the soft and hard power does China have? And where does, in your scheme of things, where does China stand in the list of the power category?
Okay, China is definitely a great power. It has been acknowledged since at least in 1972, when US went and accepted China as the inheritor of that UN Security Council seat. So there are many attributes. China's size, economic size, which is rapidly going to be number one, and assuming there's no major catastrophic events. And then, of course, military power. Right now, China's military power is a great power, not a superpower, but it is rapidly developing capabilities. Many are symmetrical Navy, 600-ship Navy, technological superiority on many weapon systems, nuclear capabilities. But it is careful not to suddenly increase that capabilities to threaten the US in a direct manner. So China has been prudent to some extent, but the point is, it is perhaps the only state that can really challenge the US in the, let's say, 2030, 2040 onwards. If the current growth rate continues, if its technological developments in AI, many areas that it is really becoming very important power player, and its capacity to play a big role in global security order. Sometimes it doesn't play that, but that's another point to discuss. Soft power, yes, this is actually a fascinating subject because it tried to really play the soft power using the peaceful rise strategy. Then, of course, Confucian institutes. A lot of it was propaganda, and China's biggest problem is the lack of freedom. Means it's not an attractive power, or it was actually, people were traveling, before Xi Jinping's time to China, studying Mandarin, becoming a very important culture, etc. So it already has that cultural power. It needs perhaps something else beyond the narrowness of it. And the challenge is, it is not inclusive as, say, a liberal state like the US is, but they don't really seem to care much. But it is inclusive to the point that the BRI is a grand strategic vision, and that is a bit like the East India Company. If it can have a major control over the infrastructure, economic development of a large number of states, then you are a superpower. And it will be a different superpower in the 21st century. It won't be a typical like Russia or Soviet Union. I think it is trying to avoid that Soviet pitfalls, such as threatening others, becoming a coercive state, or even directly conquering other territories, except South China Sea, but that is again somewhat contested. So there are a number of things it has got. But the point is that it has the ambition. Mr. Xi Jinping has declared in an indirect way that by the time it reaches the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's takeover, that is 2049, it wants to be the leading power of the world. And it is potentially likely to get there, except that the US will still be there, I think, because there are many attributes the US have are not easy to replicate for China. But it is definitely a global power. It is spreading its interest in Latin America, Africa, even Arctic, Antarctic, very regions that others never thought would go there. So, and Asia Pacific, it is the leading trading partner of most states, including India right now.
So, and I want to dig into this a little bit, but now let us bring up the subject of India, because you mentioned in your book that there's almost a civilizational pull which has been institutionalized, because the book's title is from Nehru, referring to the first Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Nehru, to Prime Minister Modi, the current Prime Minister of India, that this drive to get recognition as a major power is civilizational, it's institutionalized. Where has this come from? Because in your book, you also mentioned it's not perhaps as prevalent in other perhaps older civilization countries such as Turkey, Iran, Egypt, Italy, Greece. So where does this drive for India come from?
Well, it is certainly the long-lasting civilizations of the world which retain geographical space, large geographical space, other than China. Egypt shrunk, it's not big enough. Turkey is small, but Turkey is not that small. Then, of course, Greece is not that small and not that big. So you have the urge there, partly because a continuous civilization, of course, conquered and destroyed by various invaders over a period of time. Still, it persisted, mostly Hindu civilization and Buddhist and other contributors there. But the critical thing is, before the British arrived, studies show that India or subcontinent contributed some 26% of the world economy, China some 28%. So economically, it was a big player, big pull factor, the natural resources, spices and things like that. The Western navigators wanted to get to India's shores. Okay, so there is an attraction there. But more importantly, civilizationally, India's contribution to Asia's religious and other civilizations are immense. I just returned from Taiwan, and Taiwan has this big palace museum. And I have taken photos of many of the Buddhist sutras and mantras are all there in Sanskrit. This really makes you feel good that it is amazing how that religion spread peacefully from India and entire Southeast Asia and Japan. There are a lot of places where it spread. Of course, India abandoned it. India didn't keep it. Only 2% of Indians, I believe, are Buddhists. But the point is that civilizationally, it has played a big role. And anybody visiting Indonesia, Bali, or Angkor Wat will realize what it was playing a major role. And much of that spread was peaceful. Okay, so that's one. This notion that India is home to at least 2-3 major religions and then adopted other religions, Islam, Christianity, etc., that it should have a role to play. But more than that, the freedom struggle was very much the cause of this initial expectation. You may recall Nehru and others had a vision that India should lead the downtrodden or countries that were not independent. So it took a lead in United Nations, and the non-aligned movement was to create a third force. And India was upset by the Cold War because Nehru feared that it would potentially lead to World War III. And in World War III, India would suffer again. That was the fear. So this desire to play an autonomous role is strategic. It is based on survival instincts too, and realization that its assets are not being utilized properly. It's not getting the recognition, and it can play a bigger role for common good, collective goods, such as Nehru did in the decolonization process in the UN. There was a resolution that India was a big player in that. So the problem is there wasn't enough material capacity. By the time the British left, the same Indian economy was 3.6% of the world economy. Trade was really low, and the per capita income was below $300, and a horrendous amount of poverty. So despite that, the elite never gave up that idea. And you will notice that this ups and downs over a period of time. The nuclear factor, for instance, the testing was very much driven by this desire to be recognized. The space program, all these frontier technologies, actually a big mistake was neglecting the applied technology part. And then educational system privileging the upper class in IITs and IIMs, etc., all with a desire to get there as a recognized major power. But it became more feasible after the 91 liberalization. And then, of course, the US started accepting India as a de facto nuclear state. And that conflict with the US, the Western countries over nuclear weapons, was very much driven by this desire to be recognized. And it wasn't easy because it missed two boats. Actually, I discussed that in the book 1945, in San Francisco, where you're sitting. The UN system was established. India was a colony. It did not get into the Security Council. In 1968, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, India did not have nuclear weapons tested by then. So those tested got a special rank as a nuclear weapon state. So it missed these boats that all created considerable anxiety in the Indian psyche. And there's a 98 test is actually a test to be recognized. Of course, the initial reaction was non-recognition and hostility, but that changed. So there is a deep-rooted notion that we are capable of a lot more, we deserve a lot more, but being pulled down by various factors, including the international factors and domestic constraints, and that is one of my biggest focus in the book.
So, Professor Paul, but this also has a certain risk, this civilizational push, because it ignores the fact that India has a sizable Muslim minority, a Christian minority. You obviously mentioned a Buddhist minority, a Sikh minority. Does the civilization pull ignore the last 1,000 years of India's history?
Well, that's the difference between the Nehruvian civilizational approach and the BJP's approach. The Nehruvian approach was inclusive. Ambedkar and all created a constitution which gave rights to the minorities to practice their religion and have even their own civil codes. So the idea was that India is a civilization of multiple entities, that it should be given, they should have a role in this complex country. And that started to wither away with the arrival of the BJP. To some great extent, Mr. Modi's leadership. The idea is that India is essentially a Hindu civilization, that's the RSS version, that others should be secondary in their search for a role. And that is a challenge, but Indian electorate recently rejected that to some extent. But it's not gone yet, and it will not go away easily because a lot of it to do with how people look at religious nationalism and religious identity as more important than civic nationalism or civic virtue. So a multicultural country based on civic nationalism, say US or Canada or Australia, does not privilege one religion, although we see that temptation in the US too in these days, but it's clear that for societal peace, you need acceptance of different groups. In India's case, it has major problems because a great power has to be recognized by others. Its culture and civilization is a valuable one. Now, if you say we are an exclusive religious nationalism, it is appealing to certain segments of the diaspora, but which other country has really given it a prominent role? India is accepted because of its economic importance, its demographic importance, and the peaceful aspects of its civilization. This is where Mahatma Gandhi comes in. He's a brilliant man when you think about, he pulled out ahimsa and then made it a grand strategy of fight this big empire. And how brilliantly he played that game. I mean, a lot of factors there. But the point is, and that is attractive to rest of the world, including America's civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr., how many countries started looking at it as that's the way to fight an evil empire? So this is where the challenge is, whether the current movement can produce an attractive, which is soft power, is when people value you as an attractive partner, or they will look at you if you are going to be difficult to deal with. But diplomacy can compensate, your geopolitical position can compensate to some extent, and that's what is happening to India now. Because of the China's rise, India is courted, but even that has limitations, as I argue that You need to legitimize your position. That legitimation comes if you are an attractive power. And India has a lot of attractiveness, which is what is often we forget. And so a narrow civilizational approach, in my mind, will not bring that global attractiveness or global position or legitimate its position. It may get in councils, memberships, but to be attractive, you don't want to show that you discriminate your own people. And that's a problem for China, but it is covering it up quite well, whether in Xinjiang or Tibet. But India's case, it's spread out. It's not concentrated in one or two regions. So any suppression of minority rights will, and India is an open book. It's not difficult to report on India. So India needs the global press, the world press, as an attractive partner. India needs to engage. India needs the help of a lot of people, including people like us. A great power status requires intellectual dialogue, engagement. So if you go for a narrow frame of a civilization, it will turn off people. People will stop coming to your country, starting to happen to China. So there are a number of things there that is involved in this discussion that you are posing, the question that you just posed.
So thank you. And thank you for addressing that, because early on you had brought up the differences between China and the United States. And you pointed out the two different parts. And I'm just wondering whether pursuing an inclusive path gives a country more credibility. For example, would China have more credibility in reaching superpower status had it adopted that same inclusive path?
Absolutely. The American strength is that, actually, because despite all its pitfalls, it attracts people from around the world, including people like you and I, and then educate you, then you become part of the American mainstream, which is very rare in human history. Think about it, which countries do that. Both China and India refuse to do that. I think even India's case, even the diaspora, they put limitations on us going back or doing things to help India in some sense. But the point is that this is partly a result of ethnic composition, civilizational idea that we are strong enough. Why do we need others to come and help us? But China has done a lot better in terms of attracting Chinese scientists and others through different programs and technology partnerships. India has also, to some extent, technology partnerships, but that's not enough. India should become many aspects of the US system is attractive for India. And indeed, the constitution makers drew from all the constitutions, US, Canada, to different parts of the world, wrote a very composite document that has got some of the best ideas from many parts of the world. So India could definitely benefit by looking at the attractiveness of America. There are also some bad things in America, which we all know. But the point is that as a great power, its soft power sometimes goes through ups and downs, and potentially a new administration may create more troubles. But the point is, it returns to some form of liberal order. And liberalism is not always peaceful. In fact, that is a weakness of the US, that it used force often unnecessarily. So there are things that India can learn, but also not to learn, which is not to get into too many wars. And these wars really destroy you in your soft power in the long run.
So, Professor Paul, one of the elements of being a great power is really internal development. India is always, as you mentioned in your book several times, quite good from the time of Prime Minister Nehru, of external power projection, whether it's the non-alignment movement or any that came afterwards. But in terms of internal development, India seems to have missed out on key elements. Could you address this fundamental question? You brought up defense spending at 2%, about 2%, but internal development, especially in R&D, has even been lower, much lower than is necessary for a country like India to be a great power.
Absolutely.
Why was the strategy taken?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because many other countries, poorer countries like Korea to Taiwan to in Southeast Asian countries, devoted a lot more attention to education, mass education, and healthcare. India has been not paying enough attention. Less than 2% went into education, and 1% out of that for the higher education, and 1% to mass education. And the second problem, same with health care, India did not pay enough attention. Even today, India's spending is 2.9% on both healthcare and education. So India has neglected this development of its population. It has potentially a lot to do with the kind of caste system, a lot to do with the bureaucratic attitude towards development. But this really affected India's development. Its economy, its quality of life would have been any day superior to many other countries if it devoted a bit more attention. And look within India, I mean, you must have been to Kerala or other places, Goa, where they have devoted some 30% of their state GDP to education, and look at the development that has taken place, fast becoming a middle income state and attracting workers from all over the place, despite its own many pathologies. Tamil Nadu fast becoming, Karnataka, I cannot say that. So the southern states have shown that it's possible to change the spending. But northern states, in particular, the so-called Bimaru states, have great trouble devoting attention to this mass education, healthcare, etc. So the reason why, that is why India is in Human Development Index, India's position is very low, 132. And parts of India are not developed at all in the global standard, in terms of global standards. So you're aspiring to be a great power, but we have this humongous weakness in developing your population. And then, of course, the quality of life of India is declining with the states, with all the cities becoming environmental disasters, you know, the air we breathe, etc. So a lot of attention is needed. And so this idea of status is sometimes problematic. The typical great power is not going to help India. India needs to look at even those typical great powers, including Meiji Japan, today's China, or of course Xi Jinping to some extent, Germany under Bismarck, Peter the Great of Russia, all of them said that our people have to develop. Japan's main message was rich country, strong army, okay? So you go around the world, learn the techniques, bring all that, and become an industrial power. So this has to happen in a different manner, of course, that a realization has to come that others will recognize you as a very important player if your people are developing simultaneously. A segment of India is developing rapidly, and that's why we have billionaires, and the inequality index India is very high today. We know that India is one of the most unequal places in the world. So it is not easy for India to bridge these things. It has many structural features that are not visible in many other parts. So it needs social engineering, substantial amount of political effort, and inculcating in the bureaucracy and the political class the idea that to be recognized as a major player in the world, you need to work hard. You need to change your attitude. This is one achievement of Chinese Communist Party to some extent. I'm not saying they're the best, but the point is they do inculcate in the local level onwards that China has a mission to become a great power. And that is important, or a superpower, let's put it that way. It's so important happen in India too.
But I think that, and by the way, we have quite a few questions coming in, and we have limited time left. I think the larger question was, why did India not go down the path? Why did India choose prestige projects such as space, such as nuclear weapons, as opposed to developing its own population? Because does that not affect the credibility of India on the international stage?
You needed both. That's what I'm saying. You need both because when you engage the other great powers, you need that hard power. But if you ignore the other secondary technologies or others, then your population won't survive. So or do well. So a lot to do with the way India emerged out of the world system. And I think a lot to do with some of the social structure India has. The hierarchy is much deeply embedded in India than most other places. Perhaps the US race system is one that is comparable. But to break that hierarchy, you really need to put in a lot more effort. And so the elite class somehow ignored that. So you try to learn lessons that did not happen easily.
So you bring up China repeatedly. I think the question is, does China take India seriously as a competitor on the world stage? That's my first question. And as an additional question to that, when you spoke at the beginning, you said no country reaches major power status without a conflict. So what are the risks to India becoming a major power in the neighborhood that India is? So first question is, does China take India seriously? Second is, will there be risk of war as India pushes to the stage?
So the first question, China tries to ignore India, especially after the 62 war defeated India, and that has been a humiliation for India ever since. And there is a tendency on the Chinese part, except at certain periods. Indira Gandhi's period, when China tried to create a balance of power coalition with the United States and Pakistan, India went to Moscow. So at that time, India becomes very important. Then for a long period, China was ignoring India. But now under Xi Jinping, China has emerged as a challenger to India, partly because India has formed a coalition sort of relationship through the Quad with the United States, Japan, Australia. And that India has given the impression that we are not interested to join the Belt and Road Initiative or other trade pacts that Asian countries have signed. India wants strategic autonomy. But the border clashes have picked up since 2020, partly because Xi Jinping wants to consolidate all the Chinese territories before his time is over. And so this a challenge for India is it doesn't have enough capabilities to deter sufficiently if the Chinese really push. But on the other hand, it has gotten much better since the 62 war. It has started developing infrastructure, etc. Now today, under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, the border is a lot more secure, I believe. But it is divided between two territories, two conflict zones, Pakistan and the Pakistan border and China border. So China does not take India seriously until India has a big navy that threatens China, which hasn't happened yet. But China knows that the only country that can form a meaningful balance of power coalition with the United States is India, followed by Japan. And so India has got this swing power thing that China knows, but China does not want India to become a challenger to its dominance. So that's what actually is happening. The status dominance China is seeking. India is the number one opponent or resisting in terms of resistance, number one state challenging that. Whether India can, whether this will lead to a conflict, well, many conflicts happen without people even realizing. The Ukraine war is nobody thought Putin will go that far. But the point is that India has sufficient capabilities to deter any major aggression with the US help. That's where the US comes into the picture. India will definitely form a military alliance with the US if that threat emerges. As happened in 62, people forget that India was about to form an alliance under Nehru with Kennedy's US at that point. But Nehru abandoned it once the Chinese pulled out. But China is very careful. It is engaging in what we call a salami slicing strategy to pressure India, hoping India would budge. And India will never rise up in a position to challenge economically or strategically. So under the current leadership, there has been a major effort to challenge that, sometimes successful, but not all the time. But a lot to do with the human development factor, that Indian economy and Indian people will become more important for the world, Indian market, Indian technology, if only it adopts a human-centric approach as well, and challenging China, not just in terms of military, but in technology sphere, which is actually your area, I believe. I'm afraid that if India does not pay sufficient attention to the new technologies of the day, develop its own, as China is trying to do, or copy to some extent, and mass produce some of them, it may suffer again a structural weakness in the international arena. So it's rapidly changing technological sphere. Whether India can get there, that's a big question mark.
And that is why even more important that India invest in internal development in the Human Development Index.
Mm-hmm.
So that it can keep up with the science and technology, it can invest in intellectual capital that will allow its workers to be seen as not just manufacturing capabilities, but also innovation centers as well.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that in your book.
Yeah, I do. I think another weakness is Indian universities in general are not tied to product developments or corporations, as say you are in Silicon Valley, as Stanford University does, So it is a big weakness when you think about IIT should do a lot more. They're doing some, I believe they're a lot more active now. But the point is, we are producing a lot of engineers and people who excel when they go abroad, but not within India. And for that, you need centers of excellence, centers of development. The billionaires who are accumulating money, I notice they seem to be more interested in selling their goods within India than being big innovators of products. And so this is actually a big weakness of the Indian economic order. Because of the service industry in India, the growth rate is there, but that is not sufficient to build a modern economy with all the parameters of what you call a great power, that is 21st century great power.
So, Professor Paul, seems there's a couple of structural weaknesses in India's attempts to be a great power. Are there other countries in the world that could be potential competitors to India's rise, apart from what other countries come to mind when you think about potential to be a major power?
Well, unfortunately, it could be the United States, because if India becomes too strong, too arrogant, too threatening its interest, as happened to China, the US was supporting China, you may recall. So India has to tread this carefully with the United States too. US does not want to, right now, India is not a threat to US beyond, of course, some diplomatic
I'm sorry, what I meant was India has several structural
internally,
and therefore has credibility questions externally. Are there other countries in the world, apart from the United States and China, that can make a similar claim to what India is doing about being a great power?
Well, the closest one is Brazil. And Brazil has the problem. Brazil is not in Indo-Pacific, where the big developments are happening. Brazil also is constrained by its domestic problems to a great extent, and its region where you cannot really push around because other countries really don't want a powerful Brazil to threaten them. So Brazil has accepted a civilian great power role using soft power, international law. It wants to be in institutions. So the closest is Brazil. Then, of course, you have potentially South Africa to Nigeria or Indonesia, but a large number of them don't have the many parameters that India may have.
Got it.
The so-called BRICS countries, yeah.
Now, you bring up the demographic dividend repeatedly in your book about how India has a very young population, 30% of the population are between the ages below 30 years old or so. Could that not be a double-edged sword? So if India's progress keeps up, economic progress keeps up, that becomes an advantage. But if it doesn't keep up, as you see in many countries in the Middle East, it could have a reverse effect.
Well, it's already happening to some extent. India has some of the highest unemployment rate among the youth, which I think is because it's not a manufacturing economy, and well, in a big way, and that it is not putting enough technical capacity or skill sets to this population who can then go around and get jobs. So India has not used, that's my argument in the book, its demographic dividend sufficiently. If it can use it well, it could do much better. For that, it needs to think about what would it take? The skill set, the educational system, the jobs that may be to develop a certain industrial or other infrastructure that would bring jobs. But the concentration seems to be on GDP, which is growing, we know that, but it is not showing up in the average persons, the poor people in particular, 30, 40%. And the other mistake that India is doing is some $800 million are now spent on welfare, which is very important to this poor population. And that removes abject poverty to an extent, but it has no depth to the ordinary person, the people in Uttar Pradesh or who actually voted against the BJP, partly because of this reason. These handouts are good for election days up to a point, but even the poor people are seeking now greater role in the economy, their children education and their families security, etc. So in addition to the handouts, we need a concerted effort in skill development and job creation. And the agricultural sector could improve dramatically in many areas, rural infrastructure, and the ability of people to move around various parts of India to find job where there are, or to the rest of the world. It's already sends out a large number of semi-skilled or skilled people. It could also find other areas where jobs can be looked into. So within India, there are pockets that have done well, but why don't we replicate those pockets as much as possible? And that is a big challenge for the Indian planners. The urban development in particular is weak in India, I think.
So we bring up the elections, and that leads me to a very obvious question. And by the way, we have a few minutes left. There were recent elections in India. Prime Minister Modi's government has come back to power, albeit as a combination government rather than as a sole power. What do the election results tell you about India's directions in the next few years, in the next 5 years?
Well, to begin with, it probably reinforced that India is not going to abandon a democratic order easily, that it will not fall into a typical majoritarian state. Unfortunately, that was probably an outcome if it was going to be an overwhelming majority. So the Indian poor, the Dalits and the Muslims in many places in Uttar Pradesh have decided that they need to vote against that vision. They got afraid that the constitution would be amended. So it has a positive side to it, which is if Mr. Modi and his government recognize that, a party recognize that India has to remain a pluralistic democracy, that you don't push too hard to convert it into something else, it's probably a positive. Of course, the negatives are, we don't know how the coalition governments work in the past. Sometimes they failed, but that's a capacity of the prime minister and his leaders to create a condition where the coalition can really perform. Coalitions did produce in the past economic growth, so that can be continued. But I think they have to really do a soul search. Why did the poor vote against them? And that's where my earlier point about they want development, not just handouts alone. And that development will come only if the children can go to good schools, they have healthcare and basic infrastructure they are looking for.
Thank you. So we're coming near the end of the program, and we have some questions coming in. Can you speak about India's views on, say, climate change and sustainability? How does that affect the current government's thinking?
I think this is to be very frank, it is a weakness. Outwardly, sometimes it makes good statements, but you look at every year, Indian cities are falling into the trap of unlivable places for several months. In Delhi, for instance, for reasons that global climate change is part of it. So there's no, I don't see a concerted effort. The concerted effort should be, for instance, solar panels. Of course, there's some success, by the way, but why can't India replicate the Chinese approach, although China may be overproducing it, and create a condition whereby its solar industry is fast developing. It really need to use up the abundant sunshine it gets all over the subcontinent. The second is urban development and how it can develop a quality of life in urban centers. Tree plantation. There are a lot of things that India used to do. India used to be a tree country, a country with full of forests, and how to recreate those things. Water conservation, the Rajasthan water conservation techniques, old ideas are impressive, no? Learn techniques so the Israelis use, drip irrigation. There are so many things India can do to improve its conditions. If it does not, what will happen is this temperature rise will really affect India's quality of life. The other dimension is international negotiations. India is a veto player, which means it sometimes does not agree with the global consensus on climate change. And it gets some pleasure in saying that short term, it cannot fulfill those promises, therefore it is vetoing. But in the long run, it is affecting India itself negatively. So India has to be creative, how to approach global negotiations on climate change, how to get there without really hurting the quality of life of Indians.
We have about a minute left. You mentioned that China was looking for 100 years by the year 2050, that China's goal was to be the main superpower in the world. Where do you see India being in 2047, 100 years after independence? We just have about a minute left. If you could wrap it up about then, that'd be great.
Okay. I think India will definitely have a big economy in aggregate sense, but this unequal economy is a drag on India. High level of wealth concentrated in certain segments, 1% to 10% of the population. If India can really trickle down the economic benefit to the larger numbers, India will be a number 2 player in the world system. And for that, you need a better grand strategy, both domestic and international. But I am not giving up on India. India has resilience, by the way. Indian people have suffered a lot in the past. So good leadership, good strategy, and people willing to do the hard work. That includes, by the way, the bureaucrats and the politicians. Then India could get there as a lead power of the world system, but of course, a truncated power, as I say it in the book.
Thank you. And with that, we bring this program to a close. I would like to thank Professor Paul for his wonderful book, The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi. And for those of you, I'm going to hold this book up, to show on the screen, and to share with you, and hope you get a chance to read it. Professor Paul, thank you so much for accepting this information. Thank you again for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you for joining me.